Now, here are Morgan Streetman and Roxanne Wilder.
Morgan, here we are. You're able to talk, get your voice heard today on the Morgan Streetman Show. Pat George is here. As always, we can talk about how we feel and what's happening in this world and country.
Yeah, well, for now, I guess we're still allowed to do that on this show. But, you know, who knows what the future holds, right? I mean, based on some of what we've seen happening just last week and over the weekend, things are changing fast in this country. And, you know, that's one of the things I think I'd like for the listeners to contemplate. And that is, you know, what kind of a country do we want to live in? And what kind of a country do we live in? Do we believe in?
Do we get a choice?
Well, you know, it does, you know, that's why I say. People say, you know, vote them out next time. Vote them out next time. Well, I guess if the vote was honest and the voting systems worked, that would be a good strategy. But if it's not, I'm not sure how it's going to be any different next time than what we just saw this time. You know, how do you, I mean, isn't the definition of insanity doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result? I mean, how are we going to expect there's going to be a more honest vote next time? If you think there were problems with the vote this time, and anybody that's listened to this show for any length of time would be aware that we basically, or at least I basically think there were problems with the vote this time. I think it's pretty obvious that there were problems. And you know, what's kind of disappointing, at least to me, is we saw a repeat of the exact scenario. So exactly what happened on the November 3rd election with the stopping of the vote count at one point in the night when the Republicans were ahead. You know, everybody has to go home and go to sleep now. This new phenomenon during voting day where all the vote workers, we can't run more than one shift. People don't want to stay up. They need to get home and get to bed, and they'll come back tomorrow or perhaps next week, sometime later, and finish up the job. But anyway, they went to bed, and the Republicans were ahead, although slightly. And, you know, magically, we get up the next morning, and both of the Democrat senators in Georgia had won. It was like a repeat on a smaller scale of what happened November 3rd. And this is sort of one of the reasons that I think some people ahead of time were saying, you know, it's crazy to think that you're just going to go in there and vote and the vote's going to be honest. We just watched in an election where so many things happened, particularly in Georgia. You know, many of us saw that video where they kicked out all the observers and then miraculously they all just go over to this one table. Oh, those were perfectly honest votes. Those were all legitimate. Well, why did they wait to go to that table until they kicked out all the observers, and then they all went to that table, and they pulled out all those suitcases, and some of the videos showed them running those ballots more than one time. So why wasn't it, you know, that one of those suitcases got pulled out, you know, 3 hours earlier, and then another one a couple hours? I mean, it wasn't part of the normal process is the point I'm trying to make. It all happened all at once in the about 2-hour period when they supposedly, remember, had the water main break. Does anybody remember that story out of Atlanta? Oh, the water main break, and we've got to stop the vote counting. You know what? We're just going to send everybody home because, you know, things are flooding. And then, lo and behold, it turns out the truth was there that a toilet had overflowed or something like that. It was something very minor, totally blown out of proportion, didn't have any effect, wouldn't have stopped the vote count at all. But meanwhile, after they threw out all the observers and everybody else had gone home, you know, then those 4 or 5 people stayed there. They went right to that table. They pulled those suitcases out from under the table, and they started counting those votes that were in the suitcases. You know, if that's not suspicious, you know, I don't think you're paying enough attention. That, to me, that's highly suspicious. And why wasn't that investigated by the FBI? Apparently it wasn't. Apparently nobody was really questioned. Nothing's going to come of that, which is just flabbergasts me, the way that they don't investigate anything that's negative for the Democrats or positive for President Trump. I mean, we saw that repeatedly even before the election. You know, one of the things I wrote down on my little list here was Hunter Biden. I mean, goodness gracious, whatever happened to the investigation of the Hunter Biden laptop, which the FBI's had for more than a year? I mean, they can track down these people who went into the Capitol building. They've already arrested some of them. In fact, one here in Pinellas County, they can track these people down with lightning speed. When the FBI wants to do something, when they want to investigate a garage pull in Bubba Wallace's garage in NASCAR, they'll have 15 agents going out there and examining a garage pull and saying, well, I mean, Could that be a noose? Does that look like that could be a noose? I mean, every other garage has the same darn garage pole tied in the same way. But no, in this particular garage, we think that was potentially some kind of hate crime. So we said, let's send 15 FBI agents out there, let them investigate it for 10 days before they can finally conclude, oh, that's just a garage pole. That wasn't put there as a hate crime for some racist reason. That's just a garage pole. And it took them a long time to figure that out, if you remember, because the media narrative was allowed to fester for like a week to 10 days. So, I mean, this just comes, and a lot of us were saying this before the election. You've got some people, some voices in media who talk about the FBI with sort of this reverence. Oh, well, 99.999% of the FBI, they're all good, decent, honorable people. It's just those bad guys at the top. It's just Jim Comey and Andy McCabe, and they misled the organization. Well, okay, maybe that's the case, but what do we see playing out? Do we see the, down the line FBI agents pulling off some major investigation and busting some of this corruption and fraud that we're seeing, or some of these bad acts by Hunter Biden? Or do we see the entire organization kind of acting in lockstep and being what appears to be politically driven? I mean, you tell me. You're welcome to your own opinions. And in fact, if you'd like to get on the air with us, we'd love to hear some of your opinions. There was so much going on last week. And a lot of confusion. A lot of people don't know what to think. In some ways, I don't know what to think. I'm a little bit caught off guard by the way that the narrative was so shifted.
Yeah, but you have
week.
an opinion. What is your opinion?
Well, and we're going to get to that. But let me give the number out in case we've got some listeners who want to call in. You can get on the line with us at 888-404-1010, and we'd be glad to hear from you. So much going on right now. And I guess the major story is what happened at the Capitol last week. I mean, isn't that the biggest story? And there was, I think there's a lot of people who are disappointed.
There are a handful of people who are from Florida who were part of that group that went into the Capitol building, and you can see what they look like because you have the guy who was carrying the podium, the lectern, and then you have creak, creak, creak over there.
Was that on the air?
Some of our sound effects in the studio.
Nancy Pelosi's here. The Crypt Keeper's here.
And so there were a handful of people who made it into the Capitol that were from Florida.
Yeah, I saw some of that. Of course, we'll have to say allegedly. I mean, who knows? I looked at the pictures and, seen a lot of pictures on the internet, say, oh, no, this is this guy, and here's another picture of him, and wow, that looked pretty close. And then all of a sudden I saw it was some guy from Parrish, Florida.
One of those guys were booked in the Pinellas County Jail Saturday morning.
Yeah, that's the guy who was Adam Johnson, who was arrested here in Pinellas County from Parrish, Florida, which is down in Manatee County. But anyway, he was booked in. He was the one allegedly, pictured carrying Nancy Pelosi's lectern. It really isn't. Let's be honest. It really isn't Nancy Pelosi's lectern. It's the lectern for the Speaker of the House. But anyway, he was pictured kind of waving and smiling for the camera, carrying that out, and that's allegedly because I'm going to assume it was him. I mean, who knows, right? But you would think they could track down who this person was. They've got such sophisticated facial recognition now that we don't even really fully appreciate that's ongoing. But I guess he shaved his goatee off because the pictured man had a goatee, and the gentleman that was arrested does not have a goatee. These people are in a lot of trouble. This guy, the Viking guy, the guy with the Viking hat who, appears to just be absolutely insane. He's also been arrested now. He was from Arizona, thankfully, not Florida man for once, right? He was from Arizona. And his name was Jacob Anthony Chansley, and he went by Jake Angeli, and I didn't come with any pronunciation notes, but in any event, I've seen advertisements for him under his pseudonym, Jake Angeli, where he's saying that, he's an actor and available to act in various scenarios and gigs. If you've ever heard, he's been interviewed before. If you've ever heard some of his interviews, he talks about QAnon. He sounds, way, way off the reservation, really out there. Now, when you hear him interviewed like that, or when you see him dressed up like, I don't know what you'd say he was dressed up like.
Fred Flintstone.
Fred
Buffalo.
Flintstone. There you go. Perfect.
That's a good
at the Capitol. You have to wonder: is he acting, or is that really his personality? And if it's really his personality, he's absolutely insane. But
I want to hear from you, Morgan, when we get back. I want your opinion on: are they going to make an example of these people? Are they going to be in big, big, big trouble?
Yeah. Well, we will definitely talk about that when we get back, and talk about some of the other potential examples that are being made. And I still want to talk some more about this whole situation that occurred at the Capitol. So we'll talk about all that on the Morgan Streetman Show when we come back.
And we are back on the Morgan Streetman Show. As we were getting into the break, Morgan, you were starting to give us some insight on what could be expected for the people who were part of the Capitol Hill invasion, so to speak. That's not the right word to use. How would we even describe that?
It was kind of a protest run amok.
Yes.
We've heard such dramatic language coming out of the leadership of the Democrat Party and others on the left. And by the way, we're going to have to come up with a new word for them. We can't call them liberals anymore, because liberals is based on the concept, right, originally of freedom, right? Liber, it means somebody who wants freedom, and that's where you talk about the classical liberals as people who want essentially more freedom, less government, more freedom. But we've, for a while now, called the American left, and I also don't like the left-right paradigm, but we'll just so we can try to talk today, we could have to use these concepts, these imperfect concepts, to talk about this. But for a while now, the American left has been anything but liberal. So we still call them the liberals, and some people like to call them progressives. I also don't like that term, because where are we progressing to? We probably should call them regressives, not progressives, because we seem to be regressing to communism, not progressing to something beyond that failed ideology of socialism and communism, which is one of the big stories of the 20th century, of the last century.
How about sociables?
Sociables? Isn't that a cracker? I think that's a cracker, Pat George. But anyway, so what people call liberals are anything but liberal anymore. They are absolute, and I use the term the liberal fascists, because that's such an oxymoron, and it's just kind of a funny way to juxtapose those two opposite terms. But the liberals are behaving like fascists nowadays in the way that they are treating people, and essentially the way they want to cancel people. But what happened at the Capitol, it was, a protest. Now, remember, the right to assemble peaceably and petition the government for a redress of grievances is a constitutional right. So the people who assembled for that protest at and around the Capitol, at the Ellipse and the National Mall around the Capitol, those people were behaving completely within their rights. In fact, they were exercising constitutional rights, like the right to freedom of speech. And so those people did nothing wrong, and that was essentially mostly a peaceful protest. Now, we've had the language come out of the left that this was some kind of insurrection. It was an attempt to take over the government. It wasn't anything of the sort. If you want to use language honestly, which the left now does not have any compunction about dishonestly using language. They use words to say things that the words don't mean. So, for example, they say that, if you say something about a certain person who they consider to be a disadvantaged class, a member of a disadvantaged class, they'll say that your words are violence. And that is not what the word violence means, right? The word violence requires some type of physical violence. You can't be violent with your words. You can't say, I really, really hate you. That's not violence. That's maybe strong language, but it's not violence.
Nor is it a threat to violence.
But this is what the left is doing. And this is classic communism. This is the same thing that Lenin did. This is what the communists always do. They change the language. They reorient the language and try to make things mean things that they don't mean.
Speaking of changing the language, I don't think we talked about this last week, but I wanted to ask you about it. What's the status on you can't say mother, father in Congress?
Well, it's interesting. I don't know the exact status. I know that was brought up as being one of the rule changes, that they're not going to use gendered language anymore. And, of course, last week's show, we played an example of the way that the Congress is now trying to deal with gendered language, and that was during the invocation prayer where they said "Amen" and "Ah woman," and like as though "Amen" has some type of gender to it. It doesn't have that at all.
It means "let it be" or "as it is."
Mm-hmm,
correct?
Mm-hmm. Well,
I think so.
Yeah, it's Hebrew, right? So anyway, that doesn't have anything to do with gender, but. Back to the larger point, which is really about what happened at the Capitol. They're saying it was an insurrection. It wasn't an insurrection. Some people went into the Capitol apparently to take selfies primarily. One woman was shot while she was in there. It was a very, it should not have happened. We should be clear about that. They should not have gone into the Capitol. They shouldn't have invaded in that way, that space, but when you look at some of the videos, there are some videos out there. It does appear that at least some of the police moved the barricades aside. Some of the Capitol Hill police moved the barricades aside and let people go in there. And what's amazing is prior to that occurring, there was a lot of focus on the election interference. There were a number of congressmen and congresspeople, senators who were going to object to the Electoral College count and were upset about the election and what had happened in the election, whatever you want to call it, the fraud, whatever. A lot of allegations are out there, a lot of proofs that we've seen statistically based on the data, based on a lot of other things. There were a lot of questions about the sanctity of the election in November, and then all of a sudden some people go into the Capitol, led by a very strange group of people. I mean, you can't tell who people are based on photographs. But, Pat, you've got a photograph there up on screen, which has, the man with the horns who, some people have looked into some of the tattoos that he has, and there are some very questionable tattoos that he has. You can look into some of that on his left chest. There's somebody standing next to him to his right who's making some kind of funny symbol with his hands, and on his hand is a tattoo that comes from a video game called Dishonored that has to do with essentially radical anarchist overthrow of the government. So, boy, that would kind of indicate maybe like more of an Antifa-type connection than a connection to the Patriot movement, President Trump's supporters. The people in that photograph just have a funny look. Some of them have been identified in other photographs as being associated with Antifa. There's some question about whether that guy, Jacob Angeli, that's his pseudonym, has that kind of a connection as well. He's certainly been at protests, other protests, the BLM protests, and others over the summer, although he seems to always be in this character of being a QAnon supporter. And we've told you on this show about QAnon for many years, which, QAnon's been around since late 2017. And we knew about it very early when it first started being posted. And, of course, the mistakes that QAnon made early on was they actually set dates. Things will happen on this date, by this date. And then whoever was doing the posting came on and said, well, we had to back it up a week or two, And then it was like after that they never set dates again, because then they strung people along for a solid 3 years believing this sort of fantasy land, or what some people would call a LARP, a live-action role play, somebody just goofing around, just posting stuff, and people were eating it up, and a lot of people believe that in the Q movement. But if you haven't yet accepted the fact that the Q movement is not real, that what's being talked about that's going to happen isn't real, it doesn't come to fruition. We just saw another example of that because there were a lot of people saying, President Trump's going to invoke the Insurrection Act. There were already people being flown to Gitmo for trial and other types of statements like that. None of that has proved to be true, as we could have told you that it wouldn't prove to be true because we saw QAnon do this for 3 straight years, and none of it ever came true.
Didn't it pop up? QAnon popped up around the time of the shooting in Vegas, didn't it?
It was, I think, shortly after that because it was in about October, November of 2017. So shortly after that. And boy, a lot of people, and people get fired up about that. But you also have to wonder, are there, how deep does the manipulation go? Are there people, who have a lot of money, and we know there are, who are involved in politics, who are spending that money on politics? Are they funding things like people to go and pretend to be QAnon supporters and to be as crazy as the guy with the antlers and no shirt on? Is that part of the funding to essentially discredit an entire movement because of its association with that type of thing? Hard to know. But I'm amazed. A couple things. I'm disappointed. I'm surely was hoping that there was going to be something else that happened. I thought maybe I personally didn't have a lot of faith in the Congress or in Vice President Pence to do something about the electoral vote. I didn't have a lot of faith and haven't had a lot of faith in the court system to do something. But I thought maybe there was going to be another shoe that would drop somehow, some way, because it just seems hard to believe that we could watch an election be stolen right in front of our very eyes. We all saw it get stolen in November, and of course now we've seen the repeat in Georgia in early January on the 5th. We saw the same thing happen again. Hard to fathom that could be the case, but now it doesn't look like any of that's going to come to pass. There is not going to be any last-minute savior of Trump's presidency, and he's on his way out very quickly.
And we are back on the Morgan Streetman Show, a packed show, still so much to get to, Morgan. You were talking about the change in narrative that we've seen take place, and if you can continue to expound on that, we'll get into some more things like the 25th Amendment. We've been hearing a lot thrown about whether that's going to be invoked. So still much to get to.
Yeah, well, it was so surprising last week because as of last week, and I don't think people have actually changed their minds. I mean, what we're perceiving here is the media change, the change in narrative of the media and maybe the ruling class, the ruling elites. They've changed their tune dramatically. And I always wonder, was this a setup? Did they in some way, have a sense that this kind of thing could be coming? Because if you remember originally, Mitch McConnell was out there really pressuring the senators not to object to the Electoral College votes. And then all of a sudden, maybe a couple of weeks before the vote, he backed off big time. And he just said, well, you're going to have to do whatever you've got to do. Well, we knew this protest was scheduled for the Capitol. A lot of people say that it was infiltrated by Antifa, and there are some people who think there's a real good reason to believe that, including, a lot of things that they saw, a lot of things that they smelled, like a lot of burning marijuana, apparently, which would be very unusual for a Trump rally or a Stop the Steal rally, but maybe not so unusual for an Antifa-type rally. And there were some people who reported smelling a lot of that at the Capitol protest, almost like there had been infiltrations. There are people that have reported busloads of apparently Antifa people being bussed in to the protest and that they were dressed like Trump supporters or people in the MAGA movement, and that those were some of the instigators who moved up to the front and who actually sort of led the charge on the Capitol. Now, I think there's no doubt that there were other people who were patriots, who were Trump supporters, who were MAGA people who got swept up in the moment and went inside the Capitol. That's got to have been the case. Hardly anything in life is ever completely absolute, one side or the other. So I'm certain there must have been some Trump supporters who got swept up in the moment and went inside the Capitol. But, who were the instigators, and were they put there to specifically instigate that, what we might call an invasion of the Capitol by the protesters? And then look at how quickly the narrative changed, because that invasion of the Capitol occurred right around the time that the vote was supposed to be going on to either certify or not certify the Electoral College votes, the votes of the electors by the Congress. And people had hoped that Vice President Mike Pence was going to do something about that, maybe kick it back to the state legislatures, many of whom, or some of whom at least, particularly in Pennsylvania and Arizona, had written to Congress, to Vice President Pence, and asked them to give them an opportunity to come back to the state legislatures and decertify the electors that they'd previously certified and look into this some more. We know Senator Ted Cruz was talking about a 10-day commission to sort of audit the election. And ahead of time, I was sort of dubious about whether that could possibly work given the time frame. But, at least there was talk about it. But then you had this sort of mass of people rushing into the Capitol. They shut down the Capitol. The lawmakers were apparently freaking out about it. And they all went away for a little while. And then they came back later in the evening after they had secured the Capitol. But the narrative had totally changed. Now it was all about this incitement to a riot, to a mob. Forget about whether or not the election was secure, whether or not there was interference, whether or not there was massive fraud on such a massive scale that it affected the outcome of the election. None of that could be talked about anymore because now the only issue that mattered for a lot of the congressmen and senators was they had to be on record opposing this, what they were calling an insurrection or a riot that occurred at the Capitol. And we saw senators who just a couple of days before, like Senator Kelly Loeffler from Georgia, who possibly could have imagined that she would turn into a sellout, or James Lankford. I mean, you could have predicted that these people didn't really mean what they said when they said they were going to object to the electors and would find some reason. And then lo and behold, she gave a speech, based on what she'd seen at the Capitol that day. She could no longer in good conscience vote to contest the election. And we now see that even those who exercise their lawful authority as our representatives to try to challenge this, who did nothing illegal, and we're talking about people like Mo Brooks, who challenged the electors. We're talking about Louis Gohmert, who has filed lawsuits and has challenged the electors also. They're talking about Matt Gaetz, who was challenging the electors, who gave a floor speech about this. They're now saying we need to punish those people. We want to get them even out of Congress maybe. At a minimum, we want to censure them or, have an official criticism of their conduct. But, there's also talk about they ought to be removed. And, of course, they had previous to the incident on Capitol Hill, they had talked about not even some representatives had talked about they should not even be seated in this Congress because of their viewpoints on the election. So the answer is you're not even allowed to question the election. You're not allowed to look into it. There may have been fraud that was so obvious it's just staring you in the face on a massive scale. And there's so many ways, and we've talked about them on the show, so many ways to look at it and see the fraud, so many indicators, so many red flags. But you're not even allowed to look into it or else they're going to try to cancel you. And that's exactly what they're trying to do to people. They're trying to cancel people now. And we see that across the board. I mean, we saw they have permanently banned President Trump from Twitter. He had something like 88 million followers on Twitter. They have permanently banned him. He's been permanently banned from Facebook. He's been permanently banned from Instagram, which is owned by Facebook. Then there was kind of this alternative called Parler that's become a little bit more popular as Twitter has become so heavy-handed with the censorship that people are moving over to Parler. I have a Parler handle, but I don't find Parler, for whatever reason, to be quite as easy to use as Twitter. You can't get through as much information as on Twitter, so they've got some ways to go. But then guess what happens to Parler? Big tech gets together over the weekend. Apple and Amazon and others get together, some of these big tech companies, and Apple says they're removing Parler from the App Store. And Amazon, whose Amazon Web Services host the Parler site, so that's their servers, they have booted Parler off their servers as of midnight last night. So now if you try to go on to Parler, Parler doesn't even exist anymore. You can't even get on Parler. So they say, oh, these are private companies, and hey, if you don't like it, if you don't like the way Twitter's dealing with censorship, then just form your own company. Go to another one. And so people do say, we'll go to Parler, and they start participating on Parler. And then it's like, well, we're going to shut that down as well.
They only left Trump with the CB.
The what?
The CB.
The CB, that's right. He's got the ham radio going.
That's right.
I mean, you're not allowed to speak, and this is where it's wrong. Think. I mean, did you know that they banned the hashtag 1984 on Twitter? They banned that.
What?
They banned.
I saw that and I thought it was a joke.
No, they banned that.
Why did they ban it?
Well, you tell me. Why do you think they banned it? I mean, they don't want you to talk about. You're not. This is wrong thing.
You can't talk about not being able to talk about things.
You can't talk. Exactly. You can't talk about not being able to talk about things.
You can't even reference a book that was about it.
You can't.
Oh, wow.
God forbid you reference the book or anybody reads the book, because anybody reads the book, they're going to say, oh, my goodness, we're living in that book right now. And we've been talking about that on the show for a couple of years. You know, you need to read the book 1984 because we're seeing it come true right before our very eyes. And this is only going to get worse.
Well, if you want to have a little bit more free speech wiggle room, you can go over to gab.com. Have you heard of Gab?
I've heard of Gab. I'm not sure if I set up an account on that years ago, but yes, I've heard of Gab.
They have 600,000 new followers as of yesterday, or members, I should say. And they are on their own platform. They won't have the same issue Parler does, in other words, but it's a little bit, I just went onto their homepage and it has a little trouble loading, and they say, excuse us, we just had 600,000 new followers in one day.
Well, and apparently they're up 700, their traffic's up 750%, I read in some headline. But you're right, they've been through it. Gab has been canceled a number of times before. They've been previously booted off of their servers. They've been previously completely excluded from the financial system, the processing of payments and things like that. And we're seeing some of that going on in more prominent cases than Gab. For instance, President Trump's campaign website has been deplatformed for being able to run credit cards through Stripe.
Well, the credit card industry are major contributors to the Biden-Harris campaign.
Right.
Huge.
Well, we're seeing corporate fascism. We're seeing the merger of government and corporations. They're all, there you go, Pat, you've got it. Pat's been searching around. We can see what Pat does on the screen in front of us. And Pat's been searching around for Gab, but he finally figured out it's only one B, G-A-B.
Have you heard of Gab?
The obvious would be two B's, I thought.
This is your first introduction to Gab, right,
yes,
Pat?
Right.
Well, it's not short for Gabbard. It's not like Tulsi's website. So Gab, like Yap. Talk. The gift. You heard of the gift of Gab,
right?
If you're a good talker.
Old is this,
I got the gift of Gab. Gab's been around at least 4 or 5 years, I think.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, they've been around, but they never. But you look at anything written about Gab, and they say it's nothing but a bunch of white supremacists.
They got trashed by the New York Times.
They've been trashed by the New York Times. All of the prominent voices in media have trashed them. And so I think some people were kind of a little scared to get on Gab because they don't want to be, a lot of people are not white supremacists. I'd say most people are not white supremacists that are part of the Patriot movement. And, so anyway, you see the power of the mainstream media. You see the power of the wrongful use of words, the misuse of words, where you're calling everybody a racist on the right. And as though, you're just painting with such a broad brush. And it really has a friend of mine and somebody who listens to the show pretty regularly and gives me some of his feedback, calls this social molding. And it's very similar to what you can read about in the book 1984. It's not really even that gentle, but it's this sort of constant social pressure that gets applied to you not to think in a certain way, and instead to think in only an acceptable way. And it's just constant. It's all-encompassing. It's through all of our media. Now it's through all of our social media. You post something that the social media masters don't agree with, they'll either temporarily ban you and turn off your account or maybe permanently ban you. And that has an effect on people. I've seen people posting on Twitter saying, I'm scared to say anything right now because I don't know what to say. I've spent a lot of effort building a Twitter following. This is part of my business. This is how I express myself in media. And I'm scared to say the wrong thing and get banned. And you know what? That's exactly the point. That's exactly what Twitter and Facebook and Instagram and the App Store and Amazon Web Services want you to think.
We're back on the Morgan Streetman Show. We like to go out there, but the world is out there. So we'll just hit on a couple different crazy stories that we've seen that we need to catch up on, Morgan.
Well, the whole shows lately have just been out there. So we don't even need a separate segment anymore. It's the whole darn show. And we've got, we're talking about some of this social molding, as some people have referred to it, this cancel culture, where if you engage in wrong think, you say or believe the wrong thing, really it's believe the wrong thing, and heaven forbid you actually speak it. You speak the truth about what you believe, because then they'll try to destroy your life. And we're seeing this top to bottom. We're seeing examples made of President Trump. He's been banned from all of his social media, now has no real way to communicate with the American people other than trying to go through the approved channels. And as we've already seen through the approved channels, quote unquote, ABC, NBC, CBS, the cable news channels, they will not let him speak. They will control the narrative. They'll interrupt him. They'll correct him, quote unquote, on air. He has no way to speak directly to the people. That's what Twitter was for him, but now he's been banned from that. There are a couple of other stories on this kind of context. I mean, there's a pro-Trump rocker named Ariel Pink. That's a pseudonym of his also, but Ariel Pink, I think his real name's Ariel Rosenberg. Anyway, his label dropped him because he attended the Stop the Steal rally in D.C. So you've got this kind of, if you think the wrong way, if you speak the wrong way, if you're seen at the wrong places, you're going to be canceled. And we've got Democrats are talking about drafting legislation now for the 117th Congress that was just begun last week. They're going to be drafting legislation to actually criminalize the attendance at Trump rallies. But it's not going to stop with the attendance at Trump rallies. It's then going to be the attendance at rallies who have certain, beliefs or rallies for certain issues. And that's going to be labeled as domestic terrorism. And all this based on what happened at the Capitol, supposedly catching everybody by surprise. And again, I just want you to think about this. When incidents happen, I'm often saying, okay, there's a Latin phrase, cui bono, who benefits from this? And look at the change in the narrative. Look at the assumption of power by big tech, by social media, and look at the criminalization of the patriot movement, of people who think a certain way, of the right, and who's benefiting from this, staged invasion of the U.S. Capitol. Who's benefiting from it? The narrative's totally shifted. Things are being done, policies are being put in place, and it seems pretty obvious who's benefiting from it.
I have a friend who is a Republican and a never Trumper, and she was particularly happy when Trump was not reelected and said, I'm glad because now I can fight for my beliefs, which are against socialism, and I'm not lumped into, oh, you love Trump and therefore you're a bad person because you love him.
Mm-hmm.
Well, guess what? Like, to your point, just because he's out of the picture, there's going to be another way to stifle those beliefs.
Of course. Yeah. It's just like, she's just like, I just can't wait to the next election and then we could vote him out, and it's like, yeah, okay. People keep saying that and I keep hearing that. And I'm just thinking, this just doesn't, there's something really wrong here. You don't seem to get the fact that the votes weren't counted fairly this time. And you think next time's not going to be a whole lot worse. It just so happens you see all this fraud and bam, Biden just barely edges Trump out, just barely. Same thing happened in Georgia. Those two radical Senate candidates for the Democrats, Warnock and Ossoff. Absolutely radical candidates who we're talking about Georgia. Come on. You really think those people won the vote in Georgia? Kind of hard to believe. Maybe they did, right? But kind of hard to believe, just kind of using your common sense to believe that they could have won the vote in Georgia. But no, they just barely edged out those two Republicans in what has for a long time been a traditionally Republican state. Even during the Obama years, it was a Republican state. So anyway, you just have to question this stuff. And we've got this cancel culture where the left can say anything they want. There's somebody who is a former senior policy analyst at the National Institutes of Health who has repeatedly tweeted that sitting United States Senator from Missouri, Josh Hawley, should be skinned alive for his role in challenging the Electoral College votes. They didn't even, try to understand this. The challenge wasn't even successful, But that's not the point. It's not good enough for these radicals just to beat you, just to win. They've got to break your will. They can't just defeat you. Okay, we won the day. Now our guy, Joe Biden, which is really Kamala Harris, is going to be president. Okay, so now we're happy because we won. And you know what? That can be good enough. And now we can be big sports, good sports about it. Shake your hand at the end of the game because you know what? We won. And we don't have to take your face and shove it, put it down in it. We don't have to make the point to your face. But no, that's not good enough for these people. They want to destroy you and remove you, and it's not to get rid of you so much as it is to make a public example out of you so that people stop thinking and believing the wrong thing. They stop thinking and believing in ways that, give you any chance to turn things around. Give your friend who's a never-Trumper but who hates socialism any chance to ever defeat socialism. Not going to happen because they're going to break your will unless you fight back against them. And, we have to stand up for what we believe in. We have to fight back against this effort at changing the way that we think. But we're a little bit behind the curve here. They're way far ahead of us all of a sudden. They're going to control all of the branches of government. Don't think that we won't see. Expect to see a push for D.C. statehood and for Puerto Rico statehood. Why? Well, because then you add senators to the Senate. And if those two territories are then made states, then what you're going to have is they're always going to send two liberal, radical senators. It's not going to be a close election ever in D.C. or Puerto Rico. These places are going to send Democrats, and they're not even going to just be Democrats anymore. They're going to be these radical Democrats, which is the kind of the new Democrat that we're seeing, which is the Kamala Harris, which is the Raphael Warnock, which is the John Ossoff, those two senators from Georgia. They're socialists. They're communists. They're radicals. And that's what we're going to see from places like D.C. and Puerto Rico if they're given statehood. And I would say expect that to be coming. And you know what else you need to expect? Expect them to pack the Supreme Court, right? Because they said they were going to do that.
Should we move to Costa Rica?
There's nowhere. This is what Maximo Alvarez said at the Republican National Convention. There is nowhere else. There's nowhere else to go. This was it. This is the place that we had to make our stand. And unfortunately, too many people didn't want to make the stand, didn't look into the election enough. Too many people on our own side, on the side of freedom, on the right, who believe in conservative values. Too many people just said, oh, there's nothing to see here. If you're talking about election fraud, you're just a fool. And, it's very sad because those are some of the people who, if they could have just taken the time to look into some of the data, look at the evidence that exists, and try to formulate their own conclusions, and you know what? Think for themselves. Maybe they could have been on our side, and maybe we could have mounted a bigger fight, and maybe we could have won. But that didn't happen. We're really in for it, folks. I'm Morgan Streetman, and that's the way I see it. Thank you for listening to the Morgan Streetman Show. We hope you enjoyed what you heard, and if you did, please click like and subscribe to help us out. And remember that we recommend that you exercise your brain at least once a week.